The Smith Mundt Act is a law that was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1948. It was signed into law by President Harry Truman on January 27, 1948. The law prohibited the U.S. Department of State and the Broadcasting Board of Governors from disseminating government-produced programming within the United States over fears that these agencies would propagandize the American people. The Smith Mundt Act was a long-standing piece of legislation that was amended numerous times over the years. In 1985, Nebraska Senator Edward Bernays argued that such propaganda should be kept out of America as to distinguish the United States, quote, from the Soviet Union, where domestic propaganda is a principal government activity, end quote. The rationale? American taxpayers shouldn't be funding propaganda for American audiences. For decades, this anti-propaganda law prevented the U.S. government's mammoth broadcasting arm from delivering programming to America's audiences. On July 2, 2013, that came silently to an end with the implementation of a new reform that was passed in January. In 2013, Congress abolished the domestic dissemination ban, and this has led to a heated debate about the role of the federal government in free public discourse. The 2013 repeal of the domestic dissemination ban gives the federal government great power to covertly influence public opinion. The result? An unleashing of thousands of hours per week of government-funded radio and TV programs for domestic U.S. consumption. That brings us to Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was born in Austria in 1891. He was a journalist who was known for rebranding propaganda. He saw the vital role played by propaganda during World War I and wondered if it might have peacetime uses as well. He often referred to propaganda by the more innocuous term of public relations. Sigmund Freud was Bernays' uncle, and Freud's influence can be seen in Bernays' work. Bernays talked about the need to engineer consent, and doing so by appealing not to the rational mind, but to the unconscious mind. In this way, he thought, leaders of nations could control and regiment the masses without their knowing about it. Bernays promoted a number of methods in order to carry out this regimentation. For example, in the 1930s, he claimed that Lucky Strike cigarettes were soothing to the throat and slimming to the waistline, even though it seems he was aware of the connection between smoking and cancer. He also used fear to sell projects. One infamous campaign was launched to convince people that only disposable cups were sanitary, and he launched the Committee for the Study and Promotion of the Sanitary Dispensing of Food and Drink. Bernays' writings on public relations became a tool of the Third Reich in Germany. In the 1920s, Joseph Goebbels, in his role as Minister of Propaganda, used the ideas of Bernays. In his 1965 autobiography, Bernays had this to say about that. Quote, "They were using my books as the basis for a destructive campaign against the Jews of Germany. This shocked me, but I knew any human activity can be used for social purposes or misused for antisocial ones." End quote. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was warned not to allow Bernays to play a leadership role in World War II. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter described Bernays and his associates as, quote, "professional poisoners of the public mind, exploiters of foolishness, fanaticism, and self-interest," end quote. In 1928, Bernays penned a book called Propaganda. This brief book begins with a discussion of organizing chaos. The first several sentences of Chapter 1 are quite memorable, so I'm going to quote them for you. "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members in the inner cabinet." End quote. And one of the first questions I had upon reading this was, where does this invisible group get its authority to be doing all of this propagandizing and manipulation? What happened to the consent of the governed in a constitutional republic? Bernays states that a very small number of people understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who, quote, pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world, end quote. My comment on this is that these mental processes of the masses that the elite understand are subject to various mind control tactics such as persuasion, consensus trance, and the power of words. NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming, and it is a technique utilized by hypnotists. It's all about language. Language is the linguistic part of NLP techniques. We can look at the way our brains interpret the signals they receive and then how these affect what we do. So examining how our brains process information can help us to understand our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and this understanding leads to more control over them. Some examples of NLP techniques are imagery training, mental rehearsal, modeling, and mirroring. Bernays also comments that if all men had to engage in the work of examining political and economic data on every single question, it would be impossible to come to a conclusion about anything. Therefore, we should let the invisible government do the job for us. He argues that as civilization becomes more complex, the need for that invisible government increases. According to Bernays, quote, propaganda becomes vicious and reprehensive only when its authors consciously and deliberately disseminate what they know to be lies, or when they aim at effects which they know to be prejudicial to the common good, end quote. He says there are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions, and the masses are not aware of the extent the words and actions of our most influential public men and women are dictated by shrewd persons that are actually operating behind the scenes. So in other words, the people we think are the influential ones are really being operated behind the scenes. The power of these invisible rulers is concentrated in the hands of the few. Another interesting concept discussed by Bernays in this book is the idea of the individual versus the collective mindset. Bernays says the group has mental characteristics that are distinct from those of the individual. He claims that if the mechanisms and motives of the group can be understood, techniques can be developed that will control and regiment the masses without their knowing it. It is also important to influence leaders, according to Bernays. Human beings naturally seek group interactions and are heavily influenced by the group. The leader, in turn, can influence this group. Bernays believes men are rarely aware of the real motivations behind their actions, so therefore they can be easily manipulated through symbols and words. The subconscious mind is influenced by symbols and images. The right brain notices what the left brain does not register. This is why it is so critical to develop symbolic literacy and to be able to decode what is being hidden in plain view. So who are these leaders that need to be influenced so they can in turn influence the group? That would be musicians, pop culture icons, sports figures, and actors. All of these are utilized to mold the public mind. The question that is asked in selecting these leaders is, who or what can I use to get the desired effect? To conclude this, I'd like to give a few other notable quotes from the book, and keep in mind this was published in 1928. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. The American motion picture is the greatest unconscious carrier of propaganda in the world today. It is a great distributor for ideas and opinions. The motion picture can standardize the ideas and habits of a nation. The engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process, the freedom to persuade and suggest. Propaganda will never die out. Intelligent men must realize that propaganda is the modern instrument by which they can fight for productive ends and help bring order out of chaos. That's one of my favorites. If you can influence the leaders, either with or without their conscious cooperation, you automatically influence the group which they sway. Men are rarely aware of the real reasons which motivate their actions. And finally, the minority has discovered a powerful help in influencing majorities. It has been found possible to so mold the minds of the masses that they will throw their newly gained strength in the desired direction. In the present structure of society, this practice is inevitable. Whatever of social importance is done today, whether in politics, finance, manufacture, agriculture, charity, education, or other fields, must be done with the help of propaganda. Propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government. And a couple of questions to think about. First, should mass media be able to implement and manipulate strategies in order to alter global perception about events, people, and situations? Should government be allowed to pay journalists to spread disinformation? And is it ethical for the U.S. government to disseminate propaganda, both abroad and at home?